My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the baby monitor, ensuring every corner of the nursery was visible. It was the first time Jack and I were leaving our little Ethan alone since his birth 3 weeks ago. My mother-in-law, Mrs. Harper, had insisted we take a break, and reluctantly, I agreed. Before leaving, I carefully showed her Ethan's sleep sack, emphasizing how important it was not to use any blankets, especially near his face. "You're just being paranoid," she had chuckled, but I saw her nod, so I left, feeling a tad reassured. The cafe where Jack and I sat was cozy, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept glancing at my phone, the live feed from the baby monitor playing. Jack reached across the table, covering my hand with his. "He'll be fine," he assured me, but his words did little to soothe my anxiety. About an hour into our lunch, I noticed something on the monitor that made my heart skip a beat. Mrs. Harper was swaddling Ethan, not with the sleep sack, but with a blanket tightly wrapped around his hips. My instructions had been clear, and yet there she was doing the exact opposite. I felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. "Jack, we need to go." "Now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We hurried back, finding Ethan asleep in his crib, the blanket still snug around him. Mrs. Harper greeted us with a smile, oblivious to my distress. "He just wouldn't settle without a swaddle," she explained. I bit back my frustration, nodding politely while inside I seethed. It was more than just a disregard for my instructions, it was a blatant disrespect for my role as Ethan's mother. Strike one, I thought bitterly. That night, as Jack slept soundly, I lay awake, Ethan's soft breathing the only sound in the dark room. The incident replayed in my mind, fueling a growing resolve. I needed to be firmer, set clearer boundaries. My child's safety was at stake, and I wouldn't let anyone, not even Mrs. Harper, undermine that. Weeks had passed since the first incident, and my trust in Mrs. Harper remained shaky. Yet, when Jack suggested another brief outing, a movie this time, I agreed, but with one addition: I had installed cameras in the house. It wasn't just about watching Ethan, it was about ensuring my instructions were followed. Before leaving, I walked Mrs. Harper through Ethan's routine again, stressing the importance of using the sleep sack and not swaddling him with a blanket. I also asked her to send me pictures or updates, as being away from Ethan still made me anxious. Her response was curt, almost dismissive. "Maybe, if I have time," she said, adding that I should keep my phone silent in the cinema. Her tone stung, and I left feeling a mixture of anger and helplessness. In the dim light of the movie theater, I found myself checking the live feed on my phone more than watching the screen. Mrs. Harper seemed to be taking adequate care of Ethan, but there were no messages, no pictures, nothing. Frustrated, I nudged Jack, whispering about what was happening. Reluctantly, he texted his mother, and only then did a couple of photos come through. It wasn't just about the pictures. It was her attitude, the way she disregarded my requests as if they were unimportant. After the movie, Jack tried to reassure me. "She sent the photos, didn't she?" he said, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't about the photos. It was about respect, about listening to the mother of the child she was caring for. I felt a growing rift, not just with Mrs. Harper, but with Jack too, for not understanding my concerns. That night, as I held Ethan close, feeding him before bed, I felt a deepening resolve. This wasn't something I could just let slide. My role as a mother was being questioned, my instructions ignored. It was more than just a simple disagreement, it was a fundamental clash of beliefs and values about how to care for my child. And I knew then that something had to change. In the weeks that followed, the tension between Mrs. Harper and me grew palpable. Each visit from her seemed to widen the gap of misunderstanding and distrust. Jack, trying to play the mediator, often found himself caught in the crossfire of our silent battles. The third strike came unannounced, on a seemingly ordinary afternoon. Mrs. Harper was babysitting Ethan while I caught up on some work from home. From my study, I could hear her cooing and talking to Ethan, a sound that should have brought comfort, but instead heightened my alertness. I decided to check on them, a decision that led to the ignition of a smoldering conflict. I found Mrs. Harper pulling Ethan's hands away from his mouth, her actions more forceful than necessary. "He'll become a thumbsucker if you let him do that," she scolded, not noticing my presence. I watched, horrified, as she aggressively shoved a pacifier into his mouth. My heart raced. This was not just about a pacifier or thumb-sucking. It was about her overstepping, controlling how I chose to raise my son. I confronted her then and there, my voice firm yet trembling with restrained emotion. "Mrs. Harper, it's perfectly normal for babies his age to explore with their hands. Please don't do that." Her response was a mix of disbelief and defiance. "I raised 3 children. I think I know what I'm doing," she retorted, her tone dismissive. The final straw came later that day when we argued about how to put Ethan to sleep. Despite my insistence on following pediatrician recommendations to lay him on his back, Mrs. Harper argued relentlessly for the old ways she was accustomed to. It was a clash of generations, of old beliefs versus new, scientifically backed practices. That evening, as I lay in bed, a torrent of emotions swept over me. Frustration, anger, helplessness. Jack, sensing my distress, tried to offer comfort, but his words felt empty. "She means well," he said, but that was no longer enough. Mrs. Harper's actions were not just infuriating, they were a direct challenge to my authority as Ethan's mother. I realized then that my relationship with Mrs. Harper had reached a critical point. I could no longer allow her to undermine my parenting choices, no matter her intentions. The safety and well-being of Ethan were paramount, and I was determined to protect that, even if it meant confronting and possibly alienating Mrs. Harper. My role as a mother was clear, and I knew I had to stand my ground for Ethan's sake. Spring brought with it a new challenge, one that threatened to upend the precarious balance I had managed to maintain with Mrs. Harper. During a casual family dinner, she announced her retirement, her voice laced with a mix of pride and anticipation. What followed, however, sent a jolt of anxiety through me. She offered to become Ethan's full-time caregiver, a proposition that caught me completely off guard. Jack seemed thrilled by the idea, seeing it as a perfect solution. "Think of the money we'll save on childcare," he said enthusiastically. But for me, the thought of leaving Ethan in Mrs. Harper's care every day was daunting. Her previous actions, her disregard for my parenting choices, echoed loudly in my mind. That night, as Jack slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, wrestling with the dilemma. On one hand, there were the undeniable financial benefits, and on the other, my deep-seated concerns about Mrs. Harper's approach to childcare. It wasn't just about differing opinions. It was about the safety and well-being of my son. I found myself torn between the pragmatic part of me that recognized the practicality of the offer and the maternal instinct that screamed against it. Could I trust Mrs. Harper to respect my wishes and care for Ethan as I wanted? The answer, based on past experiences, seemed grim. The days that followed were filled with internal debates and discussions with Jack, who couldn't understand my hesitation. "She's his grandmother. She won't do anything to harm him," he reasoned. But it wasn't about harm in the conventional sense. It was about respecting my role as Ethan's mother, about adhering to the practices and precautions I deemed necessary for his well-being. As spring blossomed into summer, the pressure to make a decision mounted. Mrs. Harper's offer hung over our household like an unspoken ultimatum, challenging my convictions as a parent. The thought of her becoming Ethan's primary caregiver filled me with a sense of foreboding. I knew I had to make a choice, one that would not only affect our current circumstances, but also define the boundaries of our family dynamics for years to come. In the end, the decision came down to a simple yet profound realization. My responsibility as Ethan's mother was to ensure his safety and happiness, even if it meant making the difficult choice of saying no to Mrs. Harper. It was a decision that wouldn't be easy to communicate, but one that I knew was necessary. My resolve was clear, but the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. The decision to decline Mrs. Harper's offer weighed heavily on me, like a stone in my stomach. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of the impending confrontation filled me with dread. It wasn't just about saying no to her. It was about asserting my role as Ethan's mother and setting boundaries that had long been blurred. I approached Jack first, hoping to find an ally in him before facing Mrs. Harper. We sat down one evening after Ethan was asleep, the soft glow of the nightlight casting shadows across the room. "Jack, I've thought a lot about your mom's offer," I began, my voice steady but laced with anxiety. "And I've decided that it's not the best option for Ethan or for us." Jack looked surprised, maybe even a bit disappointed. "But think about the money we'd save," he argued, echoing his earlier sentiments. I nodded, acknowledging the practicality of his point. I understand that, but this is about more than money. It's about Ethan's well-being and having our parenting choices respected, I explained, my words deliberate, conveying the seriousness of my concerns. The conversation that followed was difficult. Jack struggled to see my perspective, rooted in his trust and love for his mother. But as I laid out my reasons, highlighting the past incidents and Mrs. Harper's dismissive attitude towards my parenting choices, he began to understand. It wasn't an easy acceptance, but it was a start. With Jack's reluctant support, I braced myself for the conversation with Mrs. Harper. I invited her over for coffee, a neutral setting for what I anticipated would be a challenging discussion. As she sat across from me, sipping her coffee, I took a deep breath and spoke. Mrs. Harper, I appreciate your offer to take care of Ethan. It means a lot, but I've decided that it's best for us to continue with our current childcare arrangement. Her reaction was a mix of surprise and hurt, her brows knitting together in confusion. But why? I thought it would be perfect, she said, her voice tinged with disappointment. I explained my stance, carefully choosing words that conveyed respect but also firmness. It's important for me to have certain practices followed, and while I value your experience, I feel more comfortable sticking to the advice of our pediatrician and current childcare provider. The conversation was tense, with moments of silent understanding and others filled with veiled frustration. In the end, Mrs. Harper left with a polite goodbye, the air between us thick with unspoken words. As the door closed behind her, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. I had made my decision, set my boundaries, but at what cost? The future of our family dynamics hung in a delicate balance, but I knew that standing up for my beliefs and for Ethan's welfare was the right choice, no matter the challenges it might bring. The days following my conversation with Mrs. Harper were filled with an uneasy quiet. The air was thick with unspoken words and lingering tension, a silent storm brewing beneath the surface. It wasn't long before the storm broke. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. Mrs. Harper had come over for a visit, her demeanor cordial but distant. As she interacted with Ethan, I could sense her holding back, her movements cautious, as if walking on a tightrope. The atmosphere was strained, a stark contrast to the easy familiarity that had once defined our gatherings. Then, as Ethan fussed in his playpen, Mrs. Harper turned to me. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I don't understand why you don't trust me with Ethan. I raised 3 children of my own." Her words hit me like a wave, pulling me into the undercurrent of our unresolved issues. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "It's not about trust, Mrs. Harper," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "It's about respecting the choices Jack and I make for Ethan. It's about his safety and well-being." What followed was a raw and honest exchange, the kind that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. Mrs. Harper expressed her feelings of being undervalued and misunderstood, while I shared my need for my role as a mother to be respected. We delved into our differing views on childcare, each of us standing our ground, yet trying to find common ground. The conversation was not without its moments of heat. Mrs. Harper's frustration was palpable, as was my determination to assert my authority as Ethan's mother. But amidst the contention, there was also a sense of mutual understanding beginning to form, a recognition of each other's concerns and emotions. As the afternoon waned, the tension gradually eased, leaving in its wake a fragile truce. We had not resolved all our differences, but there was a newfound respect for each other's perspectives. Mrs. Harper agreed to try to respect my parenting decisions, and I acknowledged her experience and love for Ethan. That day marked a turning point in our relationship. It was the beginning of a journey towards mutual respect and understanding, one that would require patience, empathy, and open communication. The confrontation had been challenging, but it had opened the door to a potential path of reconciliation and compromise, a path that I hoped would lead to a more harmonious family dynamic. In the weeks that followed our confrontation, the dynamic within our family began to shift, subtly yet significantly. The air of tension that had once clouded our interactions with Mrs. Harper started to dissipate, giving way to a cautious but growing sense of understanding. Mrs. Harper's visits became more frequent, but they were different now. There was an unspoken agreement between us, a delicate balance of respect for each other's roles in Ethan's life. She was more mindful of my requests, and I, in turn, made an effort to appreciate her experience and perspective as a grandmother. Jack noticed the change too. He was relieved to see his mother and me finding a middle ground, and our relationship, which had been strained by the situation, began to heal. We had more open discussions about parenting and the roles of our extended family, conversations that brought us closer and strengthened our partnership. The most significant change, however, was within myself. The journey through the conflicts with Mrs. Harper had been a challenging one, but it had also been transformative. I found a new sense of confidence in my role as a mother, a deeper understanding of the importance of setting boundaries, and the courage to stand up for what I believed was best for Ethan. As spring turned into summer, our family settled into a new rhythm, one that embraced both tradition and change. Mrs. Harper became a supportive presence in Ethan's life, respecting the boundaries we had established. And I found a new respect for her, not just as Jack's mother or Ethan's grandmother, but as a woman with her own set of experiences and wisdom. Our story didn't have a dramatic conclusion, no definitive moment of triumph or defeat. Instead, it was a gradual journey towards mutual respect and understanding, a journey that taught us the value of empathy, communication, and compromise. As I watched Ethan grow, surrounded by love and care from all sides, I realized that our family's strength didn't lie in always agreeing with each other, but in our ability to navigate our differences with respect and love. And in that realization, I found not just peace, but a profound sense of gratitude for the family we were building together, with all its complexities.